The physical aspect. That's what most people will notice first when they watch an insane feat like climbing a 3000-foot vertical rock face. But beyond that lies the psychological. If I ask 10 climbers to describe what they feel while climbing, I'm sure I will get 10 different answers. A flow state, fear, euphoria, anger, and so many others. At the end of the previous video in this series, I asked whether video games could grant us even a tiny glimpse of the many introspective aspects of climbing through their interactivity. And after playing through Cairn, Jusant, and Peaks of Yore, I reached an unexpected conclusion. They do, but not in the way they intended. All of them failed to recreate the experience of climbing, but succeeded at stimulating emotional states that orbit around the act of climbing. In this video, I'd like to continue exploring the question of why do people climb, as seen through these three vastly different games. By analyzing their gameplay mechanics, environmental storytelling, and emotional states they induce, I hope to get closer to an answer. While not outright a simulator, it seems like Cairn is trying to come closest to what real-life climbing feels like. Cairn's story is very straightforward. Ava, a seasoned climber, is trying to summit what no one has yet been able to, a mountain by the name of Kami, standing at 9,000 meters. Towards the end of the game, when you reach the summit, it seems like there are higher peaks in the distance, so the game is not a quest to climb the tallest mountain in the world, but the most difficult one. If we were to draw a comparison to real-life mountains, it'd be more in line with climbing K2, which is generally considered more difficult than Everest. The game begins in a climbing gym that acts as a tutorial and introduces the player to the main mechanics. The player is only required to climb the 3 main walls, but if they decide to tackle 5 additional ones, they'll be rewarded with a few goodies. And here is where I have to make a heartbreaking statement. It only took me a few moments to realize how problematic the core mechanic of this game will be, and 12 hours later, after reaching the summit, I say with great regret that it might be one of the worst implemented core mechanics in any video game I've played. So let's take a moment and examine what the issue is. The climbing system functions on a limb-by-limb basis, meaning the player only has direct control over one limb at a time. Once the selected limb is attached to a surface by the press of the climb button, the system will switch to another one. Which limb gets selected next becomes the first problem. Initially, I thought that the limb cycling was based on a predetermined rotation system, so left hand, right hand, left leg, left hand, right hand, and so on. That would have at least made it predictable, but it doesn't operate like that. In theory, the system should prioritize whichever limb makes the most sense in that moment. But in practice, it might as well be called gambling, because throughout my entire playthrough and numerous attempts at figuring out the system, I could not discern a consistent logic behind it. The second major issue is the auto-correction system that functions in tandem with the limb selection one. The player character can interact with the environment in multiple ways depending on the type of hold available. She can crimp small edges, pinch protrusions, insert her fingers into rock pockets, use underclings for support, rely on friction across flat or sloped surfaces, and progress through more secure features like cracks and jugs. The problem is that the auto-correction system behaves like a magnet, snapping to whatever hold is closest. Or at least it should. A rock area could allow for 3, 4, sometimes even more hold types that are inches away from one another. This will result in too many instances where the player might want to grab onto a specific hold, only for the autocorrect system to lock onto a different one, or nothing at all, resulting in frustration and lost progress. Both these systems, the limb auto-selection and auto-correction, are problematic enough on their own. But when you combine them, it feels like you're spending most of your playthrough fighting these two systems, instead of being immersed in the act of climbing. The limb auto-selection can be bypassed by manually picking limbs, but doing so adds so many button inputs that it starts to resemble a fighting game. If all of this wasn't enough, later in the game ice climbing is introduced. The player can now alternate between hands and ice access, and the issue intensifies. In mixed climbing sections where rock and ice coexist, all systems overlap at once. Auto-correction deciding attachment points, limb auto-selection determining which one is active, and the game auto-switching between rock and ice interactions. In a game where precision and timing are crucial for progress, these systems feel like they're trying to sabotage you more than help. The second major component of the game is the survival mechanics, which largely feel like an afterthought. On her way to the summit, Ava has to manage hunger, thirst, and body temperature, represented as 3 meters beneath her health bar. Ava can find supplies and ingredients across the mountain and cook them at campsites. Provisions and meals can be stashed in her backpack, along with chalk, liquids, and a few miscellaneous items. The issue is that this system will often disincentivize you from exploring the mountain. Resources can be scarce, and if the player wanders around too much and gets stuck on a wall with depleted meters, this can result in cases where reloading a previous save is the most practical option. This survival system works at its worst during the last stretch of the game, where I had to let Ava faint multiple times because her supplies ran out and there was nothing to find in that area. On top of that, there's the finger taping system, which feels largely unnecessary in practice. It slows the pacing down to the point where it barely registers as a mechanic. It might as well be a 2-minute cutscene, because that's how long you'll be rotating the analog stick at times. All of the survival mechanics feel like chores that need to be taken care of, rather than engaging systems. So the game fails to replicate real-life climbing, and the survival systems are underdeveloped. Then what's there to enjoy? For me, it's the exploration. Even if it often works against progression, in my opinion, this is where Cairn feels most alive. The game excels in environmental storytelling and the freedom it gives in how you approach the mountain. While there are still limitations on what can be climbed, you're largely free to choose your own path and plan your ascent. Outside of the final stretch, Ava can pick between dozens of routes at any time. If you decide to wander off the beaten path, there's often a nice discovery that awaits you. That can come in the form of items left behind by previous climbers, maps with marked routes, letters, messages, and occasionally a few NPC encounters. Each discovery feels meaningful and conveys the idea that the mountain is not just some 3D asset in a game, but it's part of a lived-in world. I wish the main story was as well crafted as the side content, but unfortunately it isn't quite there. In fact, the plot itself has a solid foundation and does something really bold at the end. But it's the overall execution that holds it back. Script delivery, pacing, and cutscene direction all take away from what could have been a much stronger narrative experience. It's frustrating, because with a few different decisions, this game could have been something truly remarkable. But as it stands, the accumulation of its flaws makes it difficult to recommend. By the time I reached the final stretch, I couldn't wait for it to be over. And in a way, I guess the game did manage to evoke a few climbing-related emotions, just for the wrong reasons. Fighting against the game systems does mirror the frustration of not being able to send a route in real life. The occasional breaks as you're zooming out the camera to check the terrain do resemble looking at a new route and thinking to yourself, oh, that's gonna give me a headache. And the 1 in 1,000 moments when the system just so happens to not get in the way almost feels like a flow state, making your way up a pitch and everything just falling into place. After you finish the game, you're able to review the entire route from bottom to top and see what you missed and what gave you trouble. Of course, it's not the same as standing on top of the real thing, but looking down at the rock after so much frustration and thinking, man, I climbed that, does feel pretty liberating. Jusant takes a very different approach from Cairn, moving almost in the opposite direction. On its Steam page, it describes itself as an action puzzle climbing game, except it's missing both the action and the puzzles. So we are left with a climbing game, and unfortunately, a very lackluster one. Sure, you could go through some Olympic mental gymnastics and convince yourself that jumping from one ledge to another means action, and having to look to the left or right means puzzle, but if you're being honest for a moment, the game description borders on false advertisement. Jusant is not really trying to simulate the technical difficulty of climbing, but rather it focuses on atmosphere. The entire game is a quiet ascent through a forgotten world, built around discovery and scale. In that sense, it reminded me more of the reflective tone seen in The Alpinist, where the climb itself is less about overcoming technical barriers and more about the experience of being in the present and the environment. The premise is once again fairly straightforward. You are climbing a massive structure, moving upward through different regions and biomes of a lost civilization. Like in Cairn, there are optional paths that lead to side areas, but most of the game is fairly linear. The story is delivered through letters and journal entries left behind by others. These are usually found in camps or settlements and play a major role in understanding what's going on, who you are, what's happened to the world, and why you're climbing at all. If you choose not to engage with these, much of the narrative won't make sense. While the contents of the letters do make up for some interesting lore, the issue is that they take up a disproportionate amount of the experience. Altogether, we're looking at roughly 12,000 words, close to an hour of uninterrupted reading in a 4-hour game. Most people will give up on the story very early, because the letters are too verbose and bring the pacing to a halt. Outside of this, there are very few cutscenes, usually brief ones at the end of each level. The gameplay is far more streamlined than in Cairn. Movement is handled through individual control of each hand using the controller triggers, while leg movement is fully automated, having no impact on your positioning. Much of the game can be completed just by holding up on the analog stick and alternating between the left and right triggers. The player character has access to 3 pitons that can be anchored into surfaces, functioning as temporary safety points and resting spots. There is a stamina system, but it's largely inconsequential to the gameplay. There are some brief sections where the game tries to make use of it, like the sunlight increasing fatigue more quickly, but it's still not enough to feel substantial. Combined with the ability to anchor freely at almost any point, most climbs lack any sense of tension. Mechanically, the game introduces only 4 environmental interactions, which look nice visually, but once again lack gameplay depth. Sprawling vines can be grabbed for traversal, wall sprouts can bloom into tiny climbable bumps, bug-like creatures move along fixed paths and can be used as temporary holds, and occasionally, you'll have to time your jump to the direction of the wind for a small boost. Beyond that, there is not much mechanical expansion, and even the brief hit mechanic appears only once and isn't developed further. Perhaps the most unusual design decision is to allow the player to regain a substantial amount of their stamina while they are still actively climbing. The intention seems to mirror real climbing rest behavior, but the execution removes what little challenge remained. I want to be very clear that difficulty is not the end-all be-all of a video game. A game can be extremely simple and still feel engaging, but the real question is whether interaction changes how the experience is perceived. I think the biggest giveaway of whether a game succeeds or fails at this is if playing it yourself feels any different than watching someone do it, and in my opinion, Jusant doesn't. A useful contrast here is A Short Hike, which is equally accessible but far more engaging in how it uses movement and exploration. It's clear that Jusant was never meant to be a demanding climbing game, and that's perfectly fine. It fits more in the category of walking simulators, except that instead of walking you're climbing. The shifting environments and the large-scale vistas do evoke a sense of the sublime, and the art direction is consistently strong. But the lack of engagement required by the game ultimately does it more harm than good. Progressing through the game feels more like going through the motions of warming up rather than climbing. The gameplay loop, climb for a few minutes, read for a few more, and repeat, creates a monotony that ends up diminishing both the gameplay and the narrative. So if Cairn causes too much friction and Jusant strips it down to its most passive form, then where does Pics of Yore fit in? Well, it goes into a very different direction. When you click on its Steam store page, besides the vintage monochrome trailer, the first thing that will stand out is the psychological horror tag. Surely it has to be some sort of mistake, right? I mean, it's a game about rock climbing. On the surface, Pics of Yore is a physics-based climbing game. Similarly to Jusant, you control each hand independently, placing them on holds and pulling yourself upward, one movement at a time. But unlike Jusant, every movement carries weight and momentum. Outside of an old-school rope that can act as a temporary checkpoint, There is no system correcting mistakes or guiding you. You misplace a hand, you fall. You hesitate as a hold gives way, you fall. You miss a jump, you fall. And believe me, you will fall. A lot. Early on, when the climbs are fairly short, that's not much of an issue. You fall, you restart, and you try again. But later, when ascents stretch into dozens of minutes, some reaching almost absurd lengths, that's where the psychological horror comes in. Being just a few meters away from the summit, only to miss a single hold and lose half an hour of progress, yeah, it will down on you quickly. But let's take a step back for a moment. What even is Peaks of Yore? Peaks of Yore is largely the work of a single developer, which explains a lot about its priorities. Instead of spreading itself across multiple systems, it focuses almost entirely on the act of climbing. Even its environments, which are built in part from modular assets, serve primarily as a backdrop for that core experience. Despite its limited budget, the game still manages to establish a distinct visual identity, drawing inspiration from 1880s Scotland and aiming for a stylized, period-authentic atmosphere. The levels are divided into 3 books, each representing a general difficulty tier. They can be accessed from the cabin, a central hub where collected items, trophies, climbing gear, and various miscellaneous objects are displayed. The Fundamentals book introduces the core mechanics of climbing. This includes the different types of holds and obstacles the player will encounter. Standard holds form the basis of movement, while more advanced variants include brittle holds that break after use, timed grips that can only be held briefly, branches that allow swinging, and slopers that will result in slipping down. Obstacles add further complexity to traversal. Birds can attack and disrupt your movement, shrubs need to be cleared before progressing, and environmental hazards like thorns or falling boulders can block paths or cause falls. The intermediate book consists of bouldering style levels, which are shorter but require more precise movement. The final book, Advanced, brings everything together. These routes are longer, more demanding, and require putting together everything the player has learned. Occasionally, NPCs will show up along your routes and offer brief, funny dialogue in a Scottish accent.
Scrawny mitts of yours?
By progressing through the game, the player is occasionally rewarded with equipment deliveries, such as chalk, coffee, crampons, and ice axes, which expand traversal options and support more advanced climbs. Wait a moment. Ice axes? I thought this was a game about rock climbing. Introducing the Expert Book, which consists of only 2 levels, the Great Bulwark and the Solemn Tempest. To put it simply, everything leading up to the Great Bulwark might as well be considered a prolonged tutorial, and the Great Bulwark itself is like an advanced tutorial for the final level of the game. Up until this point, the game rises steadily in both difficulty and vertical scale. Early climbs begin with rocks around 6 meters tall, then gradually increase to 8, 13, 20, 40 and so on. The intermediate book focuses more on technical bouldering style routes, mostly concentrated around shorter climbs of roughly 10 meters, emphasizing lateral movement and precision. The advanced book ramps it up further, consisting of 5 peaks that range from 100 to 500 meters. So how tall is the final climb supposed to be? Go on, take a guess. 800 meters? 1000 maybe? Sounds like a nice round number. How about 7500 meters? I wish I was joking. Take all the peaks in the game, stack them up, double them, and you get the Solemn Tempest. Some of the advanced routes already take well over half an hour to complete on a clean attempt. The Solemn Tempest will look you dead in the eye and tell you to strap yourself for 4 hours of non-stop climbing. This has gotta be some form of psychological warfare. I have no shame in saying that I did not complete this, and I never will. I am not built for it. Going through this game is like experiencing every stage of grief on an endless 20-minute loop. There are moments when you really want to give up, but know that if you persevere, eventually you will get a clean attempt. And then there are moments when you look at a route and simply say, nah, not in this life. And that's what Peaks of Yore simulates best. The acceptance that some climbs will not happen. I haven't gone much into the gameplay itself, but in case it wasn't evident already, the game is as much a climbing game as Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy is. The physics of the game ask you to abuse them to the point where climbing starts to look like you're a monkey swinging on the moon. Most of the time it feels closer to a blend of Super Meat Boy's precision and Getting Over It's punishment. I think the early levels are accessible enough that most players will find enjoyment in them, but it doesn't take long for the game to ramp up its difficulty to a pretty exhausting degree. If that kind of challenge appeals to you, then Peaks of Yore really delivers. But there's one more game left to discuss, one that, somewhat unexpectedly, forced its way into this script. As its name suggests, a short hike is, well, short indeed. Even on a leisure playthrough, the game won't take much longer than an hour to complete, and if you decide to finish the remaining side quests, you might stretch it to 3 hours. To do justice to its length, I'll try to keep this section short as well. After a brief introduction that sets up the premise, the player character is placed on the edge of an island and given complete freedom to explore and wander in any direction. Along the way, you encounter various NPCs who offer bits of dialogue, quests and activities, such as playing volleyball, racing together, buying and trading items, fishing and more. The main collectible required to complete the game comes in the form of feathers. There's 20 of them scattered across the island, but it only takes about 7 to finish the game. Outside of that requirement, there is no time limit, no fail state, and no big punishment for falling. Even through its short runtime, the game delivers a surprisingly fun cast of characters. There's always something interesting that will grab your attention as you're looking for another feather. And somehow, the bits of story delivered in the form of phone calls got me much more attached to those characters than the much longer runtimes of the other games discussed. If there's one game you decide to play after watching this video, I highly recommend it be a short hike, because it truly is a one-of-a-kind experience. It can be completed in the time it takes to clear the last level of Peaks of Yore, with time left over to make dinner. Jokes aside, the brevity of the game needs to be praised more. The game could have easily been stretched to twice or thrice its length, and I don't think anyone will have complained, but it's exactly that little journey that makes it special. In a way, I find it almost ironic that a short hike, the shortest and easiest of these climbing games, in fact the one with the least amount of climbing mechanics, is also the one that captured the emotional and introspective aspects of climbing the best. In the next video in this climbing series, I'd like to return to the 1996 disaster on Everest and look at how the human perspective is depicted through climbing books, especially when personal involvement becomes part of the narrative.